In this lecture, we're looking at Calvin and the French Reform movement that formed the backdrop and the context, not only for his education, but also for his conversion. And in our last lecture, we carried Calvin all the way down to the 1520s. A lot of these years, from time to time, we simply lose the trace of where Calvin is and what he's doing. He seems to bop around from different countries to different colleges. At times he's lecturing, at times he's writing, and at times he's engaging in personal matters related to his father's estate or to simply his engagement with the humanist world around him at this time. And we can enter into the question of what is going on in France at this time by noticing Calvin's first published work. Around 1531, Calvin began work and was nearing completion on a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia. Now, this work is often overlooked because it's from Calvin's time when he is not yet a Protestant, and it's from the time when he is laboring and striving to become one of the humanists of the French world at the time. Now, Seneca was an ancient Roman scholar. He served in the courts of the emperors of the time, and actually his dates coincide with the birth and the ministry of Christ, all the way down until the time of Nero. And what's interesting about De Clementia is it's actually written to the Emperor Nero himself. And the work is, as the title indicates, on clemency. And Seneca writes an extended work in which he argues that generosity or clemency is the backbone of all of human wisdom and of statecraft. And Seneca was a Stoic. He was a philosopher within the Stoic camp. And so one of the things that Seneca prizes, and one of the things that he really commends to his readers, as well as to the Emperor Nero, is a real ordered perspective on the way in which those in charge, those in power, need to be above human emotions. They need to have no passions. Impassible is actually the word. They want rulers and they want deities and they want those in power to be without passion. Now, that strikes the modern ear a bit strange, the idea that someone would be passionless. But you have to understand the meaning behind Seneca's ideas here. What Seneca and many of the Stoics, and frankly a lot of the people in the classic world believe, is that to be subject to the passions is a bit like what we would say if we say someone is a loose cannon. Someone flies off the handle, someone reacts with pure emotion, rather than with principled, measured goals and desires and application of rules of law. And so when someone from this period, like Seneca, argues that rulers and people who are of wisdom need to be without passion, really what they're holding out is a commendable belief that, frankly, we still share today. If we had a boss, or if there was a ruler, say a president or someone in politics, who would always seem to fly off the handle and make laws and pass legislation at a whim, then of course we're going to believe that what's going on here is not good measured leadership. And the Seneca commentary by Calvin is actually quite unique. It's quite good, actually, though it's certainly very academic and it's relatively inaccessible to at least the modern casual reader. There are a couple of features in it, actually, that really signal what Calvin will become when he's a Protestant and when he's an exegete of the Scriptures. There's really three features that stand out the most when we look at Calvin here. First of all is Calvin is rabidly committed to sticking to the text. In many ways, this becomes one of Calvin's hallmarks. His training in the humanist method of grammar and rhetoric and argument and of context really inspires in Calvin this desire to not lose the person for the sake of the commentator's belief that he has a better place he wants to take the argument. The goal, Calvin believes, and it's on display here in his commentary, is that you follow the argument of the person who's writing, and if needs be, you explain it, maybe you recast it, maybe you rephrase the wording if the author seems to have lost us. But for Calvin, it's stick to the text, man. And again, this really becomes a hallmark of his exegesis. It's not always on display in the Institutes, which of course is more of a systematic exposition of Calvin's theology. But anyone who goes to his commentaries will notice that there is always a real sensitive desire to get the text right, to get the author right, to follow the logic of the argument. Now, again, don't overplay this. This is not as if Calvin is unique on this in terms of the context of the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation. I don't want you to believe that what I'm saying here is that Calvin is the only one who does this. Rather, Calvin is known for the extent to which he is zealously committed to get the text right as an exegete. And you see it here in his commentary on Seneca. He follows Seneca to a T. Calvin's comments about Seneca are not imposed, you might say, onto Seneca's words, but rather they come from it. Two other features that need to be mentioned now, just for the sake of understanding Calvin's intellectual development. People have noticed, and it's a bit of a debate among scholars, that Calvin really is appreciative and speaks very positively of the Stoic philosophy of Seneca. Seneca holds out, above all, a well-ordered house or a well-ordered society, and he does so through a relatively complex engagement with the role of law in society and the role of the wise, passionless leader who governs and organizes these things according to the rule of reason and not according to the passions. And Calvin, along the way, is not averse, and he's not afraid, to notice where comments from Stoic philosophy by Seneca comport or connect with biblical teaching. And so what historians have had to argue over is whether Calvin, to put it pejoratively, is more of a Stoic Christian, or if he's more of a Christian at this point who appreciates Stoic philosophy. So, for example, Seneca comments on a well-ordered house or a well-ordered government or society, and Calvin very easily says that this is exactly what Peter is referring to in his epistles when he talks about fathers and masters being good, temperate rulers over their estates. Now, there's really two ways to go with this in terms of the interpretation of it. On one more excessive side, you have some who believe that within Calvin there is always a Stoic fundamental belief in the idea of fate and well-ordered society, and the ways in which Stoic philosophy seems to meld with Calvin's understanding of discipline, order, law, and God's sovereignty. On the other side, there are those who simply believe that Stoicism only rests lightly on Calvin, and that the rest of his philosophy going forward is not related to Stoicism at all. I find myself often somewhere in between. I find it far too excessive to believe that Calvin's philosophies, Calvin's understanding of discipline or of the role of law in the Christian life, or of God's providence or even election, to say that those things come from Stoicism primarily and that they're woven into Scripture, I think tends to drive down the same path that says that Calvin and the doctrines of predestination and Calvinism are this unique kind of mutation of the Protestant message that goes towards a fatalistic line. As we've already seen, Luther himself believed in election, and if we were to spend more time, we could go through every reformer of the magisterial of the big picture Reformation and note the places where they are in agreement with Calvin on this. So to find some kind of genealogy from Stoicism to Calvin's ideas of election or sovereignty or law is, I find, a bit excessive. On the other hand, Calvin's legal studies and the study of Stoicism and the study of the ancient world, particularly Roman law, does have an effect on Calvin. It affects his understanding of law and order. He has positive understandings of the role of law in disciplining a church and in disciplining a society. He is not averse, whereas Luther will be averse to some extent. Calvin is not averse to using the law to enact order in a way that he believes does not bring into jeopardy somewhat more pharisaical, to use a pejorative word, legalistic understanding of law in the church. So there is something from his Stoic Roman legal studies that comes into Calvin's thinking here. It's not merely an idea that he dabbled with it for a period of time or that it only sat lightly on him. He's a man of his context and he's a man of his education, and so these things certainly had an effect on him. Probably the better way to put it, I would say, is that Calvin is a man who believes, and he believes this throughout his life, and he exhibits this in a number of different ways. Calvin is the man who believes that God's truth can be found in all kinds of places, so long as they square with Scripture. And so if Calvin finds something in Stoic philosophy that he believes comports with Scripture, he will say, well, this is God's truth. This is an image of God, even though it's a pagan. And he has said something true here, which may shed some light or give us some context of ways to understand the application of biblical truth in our own day. And besides, Calvin wasn't the only one who found Seneca's De Clementia to be interesting. Erasmus himself in 1529 had actually translated the text. It actually shows something of Calvin's independence of thought and his independence of scholarship, that in his work that he's working on just a couple of years later, he at times finds places where he would correct Erasmus's translation and his engagement with the text. Well, the book itself, Calvin's commentary, kind of gives us a microcosm of what Calvin is going through at this stage of his life and the world around him that he is seeking to ingratiate himself with. You see, Calvin didn't choose a classic text like this to write a commentary on in a vacuum. There were personal reasons why he chose this work and why he attempted to write this commentary, and there were professional reasons contextually within the French Reform movement, which is our focus of this lecture, that is vital for understanding Calvin in his day. First of all, with the personal issues, Calvin at this time, having really finished his education and come to the point where he no longer needs to seek patronage in order to achieve more of his education, is now turning to the dreaded publish or perish kind of model of life of an academic. He is writing his first work, he believes, as a bit of a coming out party to the French humanist movement. If there's any moment where you get a picture of Calvin pre-conversion, when he is still a young, somewhat arrogant, plucky little scholar who wants to rise up the ranks and stay within France as a leading light of humanism, it's this time in Calvin's life. You see, because at this point, Calvin is a nobody. He's not well known. He's not been appointed to a lectureship or professorship anywhere. He's not published. All he's done is finish his education, and frankly, no one knows who in the world Calvin is. He reached out at times for patronage, but this does seem to irk him a bit that he has to cavort and kiss up to all these rich families in an effort to achieve some level of professional stability with his income in order to have a life of leisure so that he might study and write and ideally win a lectureship somewhere. In fact, from 1531 to roughly 1533, we see Calvin at his most ambitious and most conflicted. After he wrote the book, he sent letter after letter to friends, not only asking them to push the book onto their friends and onto their colleagues, but on a few occasions asking that his friends would go to bat for him and induce others to lecture on his book, which of course would be a surefire way to get his name out there. And there's one scene, one little vignette we get of Calvin at this time, that some have chosen to read as a bit of his character. Around this time, from 1531 to 1532, Calvin's father is on his last legs in terms of his health. His health is failing. At one point, Calvin goes to visit his father, and while he's there, he sends a few letters back to friends, again focusing on the subject of his book. And people have noticed Calvin doesn't say much of anything about the fact that his father is dying, or when he does die, that this has caused some grief or anxiety in his life. In places where Calvin might have said something personal, something about himself and his father dying, people have noticed that Calvin is still pressing for his book to become famous, writing to friends, complaining about the delay with the printer, and hoping that the book will be printed sometime soon. And it's always hard to read into this too much of the psychology of someone. But it is certainly something that people have not shied away from. We really have two options here. Either Calvin is relatively remote and isolated, doesn't want to share this part of himself, which would certainly keep in line with his Stoic dabblings, this idea of not being tossed about through serious grief over the death of a parent who had lived a long life. Another is maybe that Calvin and his father were not very close, and so his death only touched him lightly. And still a third option is that Calvin is just a jerk. He's an arrogant little twerp who cares more about himself and his books at this point in his life than he does about his father's death. And frankly, we really don't know. We can't say at this point. Frankly, the only people who have really serious convictions on this one way or the other are people that already have preconceived notions about Calvin and his either moral integrity or his moral degeneracy. People that don't like Calvin want to see him as a cold, arrogant little prig, caring more for his books than his family. Those who were more sympathetic to Calvin, of course, cast a more charitable light onto this situation. I'm going to avoid any overwhelming synthesis of what we think's going on here, but I think it does give a little microcosm of what Calvin is attempting to do. And it opens the door to what Calvin is doing within the context of the French Reform movement. Again, Calvin's book was not simply an esoteric piece of ivory tower scholarship. Calvin was tipping his hat and attempting to ingratiate himself with an entire world and orbit of the French Reform movement that was going on in France at this time. And it's that focus, that issue of the French Reform movement, that we really want to focus on, because it is the most important thing to understand where Calvin comes from and what are the things that drives him to embrace the faith and eventually flee for Switzerland, where he becomes a reformer. You see, because in this day, in the 1520s and on into the 1530s, France and the reform movement of humanism took on a number of different characteristics and tones and emphases that should not be read in the light of Luther and his German Reformation. This is frankly true of just about any Reformation in any of the countries outside of Germany. It's too often the case that historians take the German Reformation as the only method, or the only procedure, you might say, by which reformers or Protestants or groups of folks work to enable the Reformation of the Church. Well, in France, the issue was different. France, you might say, in order to give it sort of a general characterization, is a place where those who are reformed or reforming or leaning towards Protestantism, those who are sympathetic to Luther to varying degrees, have not yet really been put to the horns of a dilemma. There is no Diet of Worms for these people. There is no Here I Stand. For many of them, they can work from within the church in contexts where they are, depending on the place, depending on the time, freely preaching their message and seeing it take root. And for those who are humanists who eventually do become Protestant, this was the first move, this was the first strategy. Reform from within and try to slowly churn the church back to the scriptures, so that when you get to the point of the Reformation and needing to make a big change, it is more of a pushover than a ripping or a sundering of the old and new, like we saw in Germany. And really what happens is the humanist groups in general, and they're varied and they're not all interconnected, they're not all friends, but there is sort of this ethos of the humanist movement within France. And they were on the one side. On the other side, however, were the more strident and conservative folks, particularly within the study of theology, and in particular located at the Sorbonne, or at the theology faculty at the University of Paris. The Sorbonne was a thorn in many people's sides throughout the Middle Ages. They were a bit crusty, they were a bit independent, and they liked to tell just about everybody what they ought to do, think, or believe. And the Sorbonne loved to put people on condemned lists. They loved to condemn books and cast them out as from the pit of hell. In this day and age, the Sorbonne is not only frustrating for Protestants, but it is even frustrating at times for Catholics. On the side of the humanists, you have a kaleidoscope of different folks. The most important of whom politically, though, was Margarite of Navarre. Now that name, Margarite of Navarre, is a later name she's given by her second marriage when she is married into the Kingdom of Navarre, which is a territory down on the border between France and Spain. Marguerite was an incredible woman. She was incredibly learned. She was brilliant and well-educated. And what Marguerite loved above all was biblical studies, theological conversations, and having the best humanist minds around her as they discussed all kinds of philosophical and theological issues. Marguerite used to support and sometimes attend salons, where the best humanist minds were brought together to discuss all kinds of things. And one of the more important folks in the beginning, just to show you again the permeability between humanism and the church, and a reforming emphasis that didn't necessarily mean a rupture with the church, you have in 1507 a man by the name of Briconnet. And Briconnet was a humanist, he was a leading intellectual, and eventually he becomes Bishop of Meaux. And around him, he brought together a number of humanists and thinkers and educators and classicists, in particular in an effort to really get at the heart of Scripture. And to this day, this has been known as the Mile Circle. Now, of course, this is pre-Reformation, but this is one of the sort of leading tributaries that will flow down into the French Reform movement of humanism. By far, two of the more important intellectual leaders of this movement are, on the one hand, Lefebvre, and on the other hand, Galilée Buddha. And Lefebvre and Buddha are two of the most important figures for understanding the context of Calvin's world, because they come from two different streams. Lefebvre was a biblicist. He was sort of the French version of Erasmus. He wrote biblical commentaries, he translated texts. On not a few occasions, he actually got into fights with Erasmus on a variety of subjects. Lefebvre was one of the most important theologians, you might say, one of the most important people in biblical and theological thinking within the French humanist world. Lefebvre, for example, is the teacher, he is the tutor of Farel, who is the man who, down in Geneva with Calvin, will spark the beginning of the Reformed movement of that city. And there are a number of others. Now, Lefebvre comes under fire, and in his later days before he dies, he has to actually retreat under the protection of Margarite of Navarre in an effort to save his own skin. And in fact, as we'll look at in our next lecture, just after Calvin's conversion in 1533, Lefebvre and Calvin actually have a meeting together where they discuss the bridge, you might say, between this theological and biblical humanism and those who are now put to the question, at times fleeing for their life. Well, Buddha is a man who, not from the world of theology and biblical studies, but from the arena of law, just like Calvin, is engaged in this humanist method of the study of the classical past. And Buddha really kind of becomes the epitome of what Calvin was seeking to do, which is why in our last lecture we said that Calvin moving to the study of law was not the abandonment of theology or the abandonment of the church, because Buddha was really the leading light on this. He had actually allowed himself to move not just into law, but he studied Greek, and he began to study all manner of things from the classical world, not least biblical and theological ideas, though of course his main focus was on the study of law. And Buddha, for French culture, for French humanism, is really second to none. Calvin actually, in his commentary on De Clementia, in a moment of nationalistic pride, actually refers to Buddha as the most important and leading humanist of their generation, a claim that actually puts Erasmus as number 2. And Buddha had done a number of different things, not least of which is in the city of Paris, he had founded the Collegium Trilingue, which translates to mean the College of Three Languages. Now, this had become the seed or the start of what would become the College of France, which is an enormously important institution for the history of French education. And Buddha also brings together, both from his own resources and from collections that he was acquiring, a massive library at Fontainebleau, which is an extraordinary library. It is one of these sort of classical libraries of wide learning of all the languages that they care about. Now, the three languages for Buddha are Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Now, again, he's a law professor. He's a legal scholar. But that legal profession of the classical world has led him, like most humanists, to the study of Scripture. And so he gathers together this massive library at Fontainebleau, which actually becomes the first installment, the first core set of books and collections that actually would lead down the centuries to the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is one of the most important libraries in all of Europe. So, just to give you a quick synopsis, all of this humanist activity, both in law and in theology and in the subject of biblical studies, is taking place both within the academy and without, in these semi-official salons that are started by people like Margarite of Navarre or by Briconnet in the Mile Circle. On the other side, though, there is the Sorbonne. And this is important because this leads directly to Calvin's expulsion from Paris. The Sorbonne was, again, traditional medieval scholasticism. It affirmed traditional doctrine. It wanted nothing to do with humanism as a result. In fact, many of the fights between humanists as sort of proto-Protestants and the scholastic method really take place principally in the Sorbonne. It was this faculty, in fact, that condemned and rendered irrelevant the study of Hebrew or Greek as an effort to understand the Bible itself. I always joke, students really wish the Sorbonne had more of an influence on this because then they wouldn't have to take Greek and Hebrew in their seminary education. But what is the Sorbonne doing? So committed are they to traditional doctrines that are based in the Vulgate that they're actually willing to condemn the study of the biblical languages themselves, or at least to consider them irrelevant for studying theology. Well, by and large, you would think that the Sorbonne would have the seat of power. They're one of the most important theological faculties in all of Europe, and they're certainly the most important theology faculty in all of France. Well, the issue is Francis I, a man who we've looked at a bit in our context in our study of Luther, a man who was sort of throwing himself against Charles V as often as possible. And, as we'll see, repeatedly, he will even side with reforming or reformist positions so long as they do not jeopardize his relationship with the papacy fully, but so long as they cause Charles V enormous anxiety because he is attempting to stamp out all of this wellspring of Protestantism. Well, you'll remember back that in 1525, Francis was captured at the Battle of Pavia. Charles V had the upper hand now, and he keeps Francis in prison for a period of time. Well, before the Battle of Pavia and before he is arrested, Francis had grown quite tired of the Sorbonne and its constant, curmudgeonly condemnation of all kinds of people. The way they had attacked Reuchlin for his Hebrew grammar had actually embarrassed the faculty, had made the Sorbonne lose a few rungs on the status as a leading university of Europe. They were ridiculed for this position, that the study of Hebrew was somehow itself antithetical to understanding the scriptures. They had also openly condemned and attacked Erasmus. Well, around 1525, Francis had actually demanded, via the Parliament, that the Sorbonne kind of shut its mouth, button its lip, stop with the condemnations already. Well, in 1525, while Francis is in prison, the Sorbonne just decides to do whatever it pleases. And there was a book that had been published that was called The Mirror of the Sinful Soul, and it was published anonymously, and it really held out a Erasmian or a proto-Lutheran view, as the title indicates, of the sinfulness of the soul and its need for the atoning work of Christ alone for justification. Well, smelling blood in the water, the Sorbonne openly condemned this book and put it on their list of indexed or banned books. You see, there's only one problem here. The Mirror of the Sinful Soul was not written by a rank-and-file humanist. It was actually written by Margarite of Navarre herself. The woman who had funded and inspired so much of this humanist movement had herself taken to write really a treatise on the Christian life that was infused with this more Lutheran understanding of the law and the gospel. Oops, now the Sorbonne, unintentionally, has condemned Francis's sister, the princess of the royal house. And when Francis comes out of prison after the Battle of Pavia and after he is ransomed back to France, he is incensed. Marguerite complains that the faculty there has seen fit to condemn her as if they have any right to butt into royal affairs or royal opinions. And while Francis himself remained Catholic and remained relatively conservative, you might say, on the positions of traditional doctrine, this action by the Sorbonne was really foolish and really forms, again, the backdrop of what Calvin and the humanist movement is going through. Put simply, from 1525 all the way until 1533, the humanist movement is feeling its oats. It feels it has the ascendancy. It feels that the traditional form of scholastic doctrine and philosophy that's from the Sorbonne has gone too far and has now turned the king against them. And naturally, with Margarite of Navarre on their side, there was no real reason to jump ship and flee to other countries or to attempt a coup of the country and form its own Schmalkaldic League or anything like this. So in other words, when Calvin is developing as a scholar and during his educational days, by and large, he and a number of others had relatively free rein to develop their theology and to, you might say, slowly develop their way towards the Protestant faith. Because they are not put to the question. They are not asked to flee or die. And so the context of this French Reform movement is different than what is happening in Germany. Luther almost immediately is put to the question, submit or die. And of course, he does the great Here I Stand speech. Calvin, within the context of the French Reform movement, though, is not put to that question for some time. In fact, he's not put to that question really until 1533, when the Reformists and the Humanists within Paris go too far in the opposite direction, and they incense Francis and force him to enact persecutions and banishments of those who would be called Protestant. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to look at when Calvin comes to this dilemma in 1533, after his conversion, and as the fires of trouble begin to spring up all around Paris, and as Francis I finally turns his guns against the Humanists, and Calvin is therefore forced to flee into exile.